first, as promised, as the war in Ukraine hits that 1,000th day, US President Joe Biden has allowed Ukraine to use long-range American missiles to strike inside Russia. One particular area of Russia, not the whole of Russia. The decision from the United States is believed to have come after Russia allowed troops from North Korea to fight alongside Russians in Kursk. Meanwhile, a statement from the Kremlin this morning accused the US president of throwing oil on fire. But why has he done it now? And what impact is this going to have on talks with Russia when Trump takes his role as president? Well, joining me now is Joshua Huminski, who is a senior vice president for the National Security and Intelligence Programs at the Center for the Study of Presidency in Congress, and he's also a senior NSI fellow in Washington. Hugely qualified to have this conversation. Joshua, good evening to you.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
I'm absolutely thrilled that you could join me, Joshua, because I've been a little bit concerned about some of the hyperbole that's been flying around today, if you excuse the pun, around those missiles. What impact, aside from psychological, are these really going to have on the progression of Ukraine?
I think at the tactical and operational levels, you will see some impact. It is an extended range munition. It can do about 300 kilometers, which does place some 400 different military targets within the bubble around Kursk, within range. At a strategic level, this won't materially change anything. This has been a conversation that has been going on for so long, with so much speculation about whether it would happen and when it would happen, that the Russian armed forces have been able to move their assets, particularly their fighter planes, their bombers, their long-range loitering munitions, well outside of this range. So it will allow the Ukrainians the ability to disrupt command and control, logistics nodes, but the Russians have already baked this into their planning and will certainly respond by just pushing their equipment further away from the targeting area.
There's another question, isn't there, Joshua, about how many of these missiles Ukraine indeed even has in the first place. They have been using them inside Ukrainian territory, so we don't even know how many they've got. And that begs the question, if they're being allowed to use the small stock that they've got, will they be replenished by America in time for Trump to be president?
That's a very good question. And there's a lot of speculation about how many Ukraine actually received. I mean, these are $1 million missiles per shot. And the expectation was they received probably about 50 in one of the most recent supply packages that was sent through Ukraine. They've used certainly a number of those since. And so there's a limited number and a limited utility in that capacity. Will they receive more before President Trump is inaugurated in January? It is unlikely. It certainly is possible, but that is something that the president wants to do right now, is surge as much aid and assistance to Ukraine as possible. And I think you see this authorization in response to certainly the North Korean entry into the equation as part of that.
And a lot of people will be saying about the timing. We've known about these North Korean soldiers. They've certainly been heading over. The UN confirmed their arrival in Ukraine, I think about 2 or 3 weeks ago, if I'm remembering correctly. But they've now been moved to the Kursk region to stop Ukraine from pushing much further forward. But the timing of this is interesting, with Biden literally on the dying days of his presidency. Some people suggesting that he's trying to stir up tensions for President Trump to have to react to.
Certainly, there is that speculation about that. I think you need to look at the situation in an aggregate. Certainly, the North Korean entry has, as you said, been known for some time. They appear to be mobilizing and massing for potential counteroffensive into the Kursk area, which the Ukraine has quite significantly and impressively held thus far. Again, the Russians have not really pushed to retake that just yet. The expectation is that the North Korean soldiers will reinforce the Russian soldiers and they will push into this. So the timing could certainly be tied to a tactical or operational necessity by allowing Ukraine to do these deep strikes to disrupt the operational planning and the potential counteroffensive. There is also the signaling element of an outgoing President Biden, saying to Pyongyang that this is unacceptable and that there are connections between North Korea and Russia that are unacceptable. And there's also sort of the domestic political equation that the president wants to support Ukraine as much as possible, because as of yet, we don't know what President Trump's policies will be on Ukraine. What we can fairly certainly say is that there will be a change in America's aid to Ukraine, and this is likely an attempt to hopefully set conditions that are more advantageous for Kiev ahead of that.
In response to that, Biden, presumably as well, if those talks are to take place, there's a lot of ifs and buts here, because we're trying to second-guess these leaders, but, you know, the idea that if they manage to hold on to that area that they've impressively held on to so far, even with those North Korean troops there, would put them in a better place come negotiations if Trump were to say to them, right, you're going to have to give up something, you're going to have to negotiate something to stop this war. Does holding on to that region, that area, make the talks better for Ukraine? Could that be a strong motivation?
I think taking a step back from that initial aspect is important, because part of the challenge is that it doesn't appear that Russia believes it is in a losing position. They believe that they are in an advantageous position, and one that will likely continue. They've sustained significant casualties, over 615,000 since the war's outset, including over 100,000 killed, but they're still recruiting 25 to 30,000 troops a month. They are making slow yet consistent progress along the 600-mile front. And the lack of a response to the Kursk incursion is indicative of a country that doesn't necessarily think it is in a bad position. So the negotiations in whatever situation comes to the table requires both parties to want to negotiate. President Trump can say that I'm going to end this on day one, or 24 hours or 48 hours after, but that requires a willing party on the other side. And if President Putin sees that he is in an advantageous position, he may stall for time. He may attempt to throw some easy wins towards the president. But if he thinks he's winning, he's not going to negotiate.
No. The question I think that I've not heard anybody ask today is, how does North Korea respond if an American missile guided by the UK or France or Germany, whoever, kills North Korean troops? What's Kim going to say?
It's a very good question. And I think that is part of the challenge that we've seen in the conversation about deterrence, escalation, response, and counter response, and that this has not been played out further than we're going to give the aid and arms and authorization to Ukraine, certainly in advance of the North Korean and Russian counteroffensive in Kursk. How Pyongyang responds and how Kim Jong-un responds is unknown at this point. He has a number of mechanisms to raise tensions across the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. They have sabotage operations, assassination campaigns, ways of doing hacking. People forget about the hack against Hollywood and Sony Studios, cryptocurrency, and other sorts of scams and cybercrime. So there are many ways in which Pyongyang can respond to this in the eventuality that an American missile, certainly an American-made missile, kills North Korean soldiers.
It just seems to be lacking in the conversation at the moment, because we know that Kim will, although he's put his soldiers in the line of fire and he's put them in that danger, he is likely to take this personally. It's attack from the West on North Korean soldiers, which plays extremely well in North Korea.
Certainly, it will be a propaganda win.
Yeah.
I think the important thing to remember is when we look at North Korea, it is a wholly closed and wholly insular society. No information gets out that the regime does not want to get out outside of a bit and some limited aspects coming from South Korea and certainly in from China. But it is a closed society. So this will be a propaganda coup for the regime to justify the arguments that the West, and particularly the United States, is against North Korea and is at war with North Korea. The Korean War has not fundamentally actually ended. It is only a ceasefire at this point.
Putin, we haven't heard his voice yet, but we have heard from the Kremlin saying things like, Britain, they hate us. Britain is not going to see Christmas. A lot of people are concerned that if this, now that it has been allowed to happen, that this is the trigger that Putin needs to launch nuclear weapons. The problem is he's cried wolf a couple of times beforehand, when the missiles were first arranged, when fighter jets were given, tanks even from Germany and places like that. There were a lot of red lines when Finland joined NATO, all of these red lines that happened, and nothing happened. Is this just more hot air, or is Putin going to wait for Trump? I can't see anything happening between now and Trump's inauguration.
I think the question of red lines is interesting because I think it speaks to a misunderstanding of Russian doctrine and Russian strategic posture. In their own doctrine, they're very clear what constitutes a threshold for the use of nuclear weapons, and certainly we have not approached that, and certainly hope we do not approach that. But the issue is that the Russians know, and President Putin knows very well, how to play the American and Western media with talk of red lines, with talk of nuclear escalation. The Dmitry Medvedev is notorious for coming out in very likely alcohol-fueled rants saying that, London will be destroyed by Christmas, as you highlighted, and things along those lines. And it reflects more of Western insecurities and concerns rather than actual Russian policy and Russian doctrine. Now, this is not to say that red lines can just be crossed with reckless abandon. There is always the risk for escalation, either horizontally or vertically, and there's also the risk of miscalculation. It is all failure to cross red lines without a response until there actually is a response. We've seen just today that there was a severed cable in the Baltic Sea, which we don't know exactly what's happened yet, but the Russians could well be attacking the undersea infrastructure to signal. Russian sabotage and subversion operations across Europe and the United Kingdom as well, but also against Moldova. These are elements of response, and just because we're not seeing a vertical escalation in the use of nuclear weapons or direct attacks against NATO, which I don't believe we will see, does not mean that they do not have tools to respond to Western actions.
I mean, as you said, North Korea has the same tools. I just want, this is what infuriates me about Russia, and I'm not the only one, and it may sound like a really childish comment to make, and I apologise for that if it does, but how come they think they can have the war all their own way? That they're allowed to bomb into Ukraine, but nobody's allowed to bomb into Russia. That they're allowed to escalate in a way by getting those troops. But if suddenly there were troops from another country in Ukraine pushing Russians back, that would be going too far. Why has the West allowed Russia to have this war entirely on its own grounds?
I think first, as we just discussed, it is a misunderstanding of Russian doctrine and Russian approach and Russian strategic thought. We have self-deterred, in inverted commas, because we have been concerned about the risks of escalation. And those risks are not unfounded. Certainly, no one wants to be the one that makes a decision that causes a nuclear crisis or an escalation of hostilities. But what we have allowed ourselves to do is be cowed into a corner rather than looking for an option or a strategic outcome. You've seen this most significantly in the focus on the weapons systems, which the ATACMS is a part. At the outset of the war, it was, should we provide anti-tank platforms to Ukraine? Then it was tanks, then it was F-16s. And each step of the way, there was concern about, is this going to be the red line that pushes Russia over the edge? What we ended up talking about was means and not ends. All of these systems that we're delivering are disconnected from any strategy outside of ensuring that Ukraine does not lose and that Russian escalation is avoided. Those two propositions are not an outcome or a framework for a strategy. That is not determining how Ukraine wins or, inverted commas, how Russia loses. So we've backed ourselves into a situation where we've done a lot of activity, but is disconnected from any strategic plan.
We never have an exit strategy, though, do we? I mean, look at every war and every situation across the world. There's never a plan for it to end. I don't understand it. Joshua, it's been fascinating. I hope I get to talk to you again. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. Joshua Huminski there, Senior Vice President for the National Security and Intelligence Programs at the Centre for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, and Senior NSI Fellow in Washington. Quick break, back in a sec.